Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. Continuing our deep dive into the debate about slavery reparations, Reginald L, professor of management at Prairie View A&M University, joins us to discuss his article, The Unintended Consequences of Promising Black American Reparations. We talk about Black American enslavers, the history of American slavery, and how to frame the questions surrounding potential slavery reparations. We spoke on April 29, 2001.
I'm Reginald L, and I'm a full professor of management and business communication at Prairie View A&M University. I started at Prairie View in 2002. My PhD is from the University of Missouri at Columbia, known as Mizzou. And Mizzou is the flagship university for the state of Missouri. It's the aspirant school for most of the graduates, seniors, high school graduates in the state of Missouri. I write broadly on a number of topics. I have published 3 books, Managerial Communication in 2014, and then the book was so fat when we revised it, the publisher wanted to put it into 2 separate books. So we have 2 books, Managerial Communication for Organizational Development, and the second is Managerial Communication for Professional Development. And those books were published in 2019 by Business Expert Press. I also have a number of articles of varying interest. So I'm sort of like a person who is in the College of Business, and my specialty area would fall in the leadership category of management. So if you look at any of Principles of Management textbooks, what you'll normally find is a chapter on communication. And those communication subjects will normally be the subject matter of the professional communication, such as corporate communication, organizational communication, business communication, and then managerial communication is the umbrella of those professional communication areas linked to the theory of management. So that is my background.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to be discussing today the unintended consequences of promising Black American reparations, which you said it came out in the Journal of Higher Education and Theory and Practice in 2020, so not too long ago.
Correct.
And I would like to begin with the kind of how you set up the argument pro and con for reparations. And I especially like how you phrased it, the history of plantation slavery as the basis of reparations. So if you'd speak a little bit on that, that would be great.
Well, the pro and con, because I teach communication, my subject matter expertise is not history. And as reading through the papers, you'll see is I'm using history as evidence, but I'm not a historian, which is a benefit to a person to see objectively the issues of the argument of reparations. So in my courses, I teach managerial communication at the graduate level, and I also teach a course called Executive Managerial Communication. And we were in a Saturday course because it's a part-time program for business executives. And every other Saturday we meet face-to-face before the pandemic. And in one of those Saturdays, we were having a heated discussion on this very topic because we were dealing with my chapter and this is not a pub, but this is the book. And there's chapter 3 in the book called Communication, Culture, and Climate, which means that all the aspects of the broader culture spill into my course. And I would be negligent not to teach both sides of the argument. But I found it very interesting that so many students in this modern American system of education have not been trained as we were trained when I was 18 back in 1984 and when I started college. Lincoln, Missouri, in Jefferson City, Missouri, which is the capital of the state of Missouri, was my alma mater for my undergrad degree in English literature. But they had a Black history library. I knew all along that Black people owned slaves. But what really freaked me out was when I observed my students, not one of them knew any of the genuine history. So I said, well, let's think about what this means in terms of debate. And what I do is I normally give them a chapter from the Weaver and Ness book, Fundamentals and Forms of Speech, which is a classic speech textbook. And this is just a word to the wise that because of copyright costs, most authors don't want to pay those hefty fees. You're talking 3 cents a word or 5 cents a word. So what they do is they will write it differently enough to keep the same constructural framework, but it's different enough where they don't have to pay the fees. You know what that's all about. But after a while, it gets watered down. And after a while, it's nothing like it's supposed to be. So for example, when people run around and say, well, I'm going to do an extemporaneous speech, you go, okay, but they're using it within the context of an impromptu speech. So those two differ because there are 4 fundamental speech preparation methodologies. So what I said is there's a fundamental of debate. And this was taught way back in 1957 when Weaver and Ness wrote their famous book. Most people don't know about debate. And most college students don't know about debate. So what I decided to do was not take the road most traveled by. I said, well, I'm gonna write a paper, I'm gonna take the road less traveled by. But first, what I need to do in the paper is teach people about debate. And debate is a proposal in the form of a proposition, and a proposition should be brief, it should be specific, and it should be something which can be resolved. If it's not resolvable, it's not a debate, it's a discussion. So the issue of preparations is debatable because you can have the proponents of a debate, which are the people who are for the argument, and then you can have the opponents, the people who are against the argument. So I chose to be against the argument for reparations for various reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into. But then there are the rules of debate. Sometimes if you're in a high office, such as in the House of Representatives for the United States government or in the Senate, then you'll adopt totally Robert's Rules of Order. But sometimes in a debate, you can custom make your own rules for the debate, meaning that the issues of the debate is what's in dispute. So the proposition has to be proved. Now how do you prove it? Well, the proponents are the ones who are in charge of changing the status quo, meaning I'm not interested in changing the status quo, so it's not my burden to prove anything. So the proposition has the burden, the proponents have the burden to prove the proposition, and we call that the burden of proof. And there's a little table in the paper where I show the duties and responsibilities of each side. And then the negative is the opponents. That means that they are to challenge the evidence. And this is where a lot of people don't understand the application of evidence and the standards of proof, is that if you say that something should be, it is your job to prove why something should be. It is not my job to prove it for you. And the standard of proof is scientific. For example, in research, whether you're in the social sciences or the hard sciences, we have what's called a confidence interval, where we use statistical methodologies, and we normally set the alpha confidence interval at 0.05. What that means in layperson's terms is we say that we're so confident that when we say that something is true, we believe it's true 19 out of 20 times, and that it's false only 1 out of 20 times. And we call that a type 1 and a type 2 error in terms of accepting a hypothesis, which is true, that is actually true, and one that is false, that is actually false, right? So debate is something that needs to happen with rules. And then those rules, both sides need to understand what their duties and responsibilities are. So if you're for propositions, you have to prove it. If you're for reparations, you have to prove it. And if you're against reparations, then you have to attack the evidence that the people on the side of reparations are bringing. So that's what I did in the papers. I attacked the evidence, which is the more prominent justifications for reparations.
Excellent. Let's kind of walk through some of those, kind of the three. I think there might be more. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see like three distinct points at which you kind of attack the pro side. Yes. So the first one was the kind of political, I guess I'll call it that, but kind of the white shame, white guilt grievance kind of argument. That was the first one that popped up in the article for me. And maybe
that's what I mentioned, Shelby Steele. Mm-hmm. And what we're getting is a suppression of what we call the conservative voices. I'm a conservative in my point of view because I advocate for Black success, meaning I've dedicated my life to the advancement and education of Black folk. Now, someone says, are you African American or are you Black American? Well, think about that question. If you say that you're African American, think of the primary emphasis and the secondary emphasis of those two words juxtaposed together. So African has more prominence in the litany or the layout of the words than does American. There are 54 countries in Africa. I've never been to one, right? So why can't I be an American Black or a Black American? That's really interesting, isn't it? So when you think about the politics of reparations, you have to really think about carefully what is really being argued communicatively. If I ask a question, what is the goal of your communication? Most people probably would be able to answer what the goal of their communication is. So if I say, what is the goal of the reparations argument? Is it really for the prosperity and the posterity of Black Americans? Or is it more political nuance? So my argument is more attuned to me in my own investigation. I think it's more attuned to political revenge as opposed to the improvement of Black lives, because we know from our scholars on the conservative side how to improve Black lives. We know that. For example, one of my favorite scholars at the Hoover Institute, who is, I'm sure you know about Dr. Thomas Sowell. In my opinion, he's just a genius. And when I listen to his videos on YouTube, and he's got dozens of interviews throughout the years, he's been around since the 70s, and he's been very consistent. And he argues that there are 4 things that a young Black person can do to be successful, or anybody, and especially young. Graduate high school, improve yourself continuously. He says, stay out of conflict with the cops or the police, and, which I think is more important than anything, especially in terms of poverty among women, before you have a baby, get married. And if you do those 4 things, he says, anybody within their own lifetime can have a very successful life. And I know I'm living proof of the conservative values. I've had a pretty successful life in implementing these conservative values. And then people, and sometimes I'll have young men will say, Dr. Bill, you don't know what it's like. So I say, really? I asked them, I say, and I started saying this when I was 50. So I say, how old are you? They say, I'm 20. I say, really? I'm 50. So if you divide your age into my age, I'm 2.5 times older than you. My birth certificate was stamped Negro. I can prove it to you. So I was born a Negro. I'm much closer to civil rights than you'll ever be. much closer to Jim Crow. So I asked the young men this question: how is it that I have avoided my entire life conflict with the police? So how is your lived experiences more valid than my lived experiences? So I know that people like Thomas Sowell are correct that if you follow these basic concepts, which he considers values, Thomas Sowell argues that it's the violation of these values, which is to the degeneration of Black culture, unfortunately. So I think that political, in terms of the goal of the reparations argument, seems to be the root of the purpose of the communication.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I noticed you mentioned too, like critical race theory, which is kind of the other side of the conservative argument.
Yeah.
So that,
yeah,
I don't get too much into that, but yeah, I noticed.
well, I
that.
mentioned it.
And,
I could mention it briefly.
go ahead.
The critical race aspect is, according to a scholar like Carol Swain, who I have a lot of respect for. She was over at Vanderbilt, PhD in political history, law degree. And she says that cultural Marxism is really the infusion of Marxist ideology with the civil rights movement, which you know as well as I do, that the civil rights movement was a religious movement. You know, Baptist preachers, AME preachers, et cetera, holding hands, singing Kumbala, and they were about justice in terms of integration of all Americans, so America could fulfill the promise that it made to all Americans. And that's when you get the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, where he is juxtaposing America's behavior with America's words. So he in one voice would say, "Let freedom ring through the snow-capped mountains of Colorado, let freedom ring through the curvaceous slopes of California." And then he would juxtapose that by saying, "A governor whose lips is dripping with interposition and nullification." And that as a figure of speech maximizes the emotional appeal to the audience. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if critical race theory is something that I would ascribe to.
Yeah, no, not to, right. But it seems to be the other side of the pro-reparations, kind of the foundation of the pro-reparations.
Yeah, part of the problem with the argument for reparations, I'm sorry.
I said that it seems to be kind of underlying the political argument for pro-reparations. I left out the word.
Yeah, and I was about to get into it. Part of the problem, if you teach communication like I do, we get into this area of speech known as figures of speech. And ever since we've had Aristotle, and we've had numerous other individuals, all the way up to Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, we know that figures of speech have been so well identified that we give them names and categories. So we can say that when you endow an inanimate object or something which is animal, which is not a human, with human-like characteristic and quality, we call that personification. We can say that the use of synecdoche as a figure of speech has a very powerful emotional appeal. So synecdoche is a figure of speech term that we use when we talk about the small represents the whole represents the small. So we can say America landed on the moon, but did America land on the moon? And all of its citizens? No. Well, that's synecdoche. So the problem by using critical race theory as justification for reparations is that synecdoche is the only loosely coupled emotional appeal that can only be responded to by people who are not informed of legitimate American history. So if we go back to the table in the 1870 census that I report in the paper, what we see is in 1860, we had 3.9 million slaves, but there were 26 million white Americans, right? We had almost 500,000 freed colored, and this is them saying colored, and colored meant mulatto, meaning anyone who was the product of misogyny or race mixing. If you were Native American race or of African descent, you were in that colored count. Not all white people owned slaves, right? But some Blacks did. So if you say that all of the Blacks in America now are due reparations, what you're saying is that the smaller number in the population of Blacks in the 1870 census is an absolute representation by synecdoche of all the Blacks alive today. Now, there's a problem with that argument, and I'm sure you can guess what the problem with the argument is. Do you have any ideas what the problem is with connecting the saying that the
Right. Well, I mean, that's what you kind of argue in the paper, is that if you have free, what they called free Negroes at the time owning slaves, how do you pay white? And then some of those African Americans who owned slaves or Blacks owned slaves, they owned white slaves. So do white people get reparations for being slaves? Are we? And that was interesting to me, how kind of like, is it? And I, in looking at other reparations arguments, are we talking about people who were actually slaves and having to prove that? Or are we talking about everybody who's?
Yeah, it's a broken line of descendancy. And it even gets worse. I alluded to some of the colonial period, but right. there's a book by these authors, Don Jordan and Mike Walsh. They wrote a book that came out in 2008 that I didn't include in this paper, but their book is called White Cargo. And it's really interesting. And I even pulled it up. It's called White Cargo, The Forgotten History of Britain's White Slaves in America. And what they allude to is from the period of 1619 to 1775, there was a tremendous amount of trafficking of white people from Britain and from Ireland and from Germany that were either sold or duped into slavery, into the American colonies by the promise of land. And the only thing they had to do was work for a small amount of time to pay off their ticket price for the voyage. And when they got here, they got manacles. And others were what they call the urchins of British society, where they were gathering up children as early as 7 years old. And they have those children, those who didn't make it, when they did make it, they didn't live longer than a year. So these two scholars, in my opinion, they estimate anywhere from 100 to 300,000 white people were either stolen or duped from Britain. And if we go back to our synecdoche argument, meaning one representing the whole, then that 300 to 300,000 people who were what they call indentured servants, which is a euphemism for slavery. Because the problem with indentured servitude, that when you got to the colonies, you were treated as bad as the slaves that were imported from Africa. So if you run away, and the president, George Washington, when he's out fighting against the British, but also putting ads in the Virginia Gazette, looking for 2 Black Negro slaves and then 8 servants who ran off. So if you are an indentured servant and you're free to go at the end of your time, why are people putting out rewards for your capture? And they were tying white people to the whipping post. And they had cruelty for both whites and Blacks under servitude or slavery. So these two authors say that indentured servitude was just a euphemism for slavery, and it was pretty much a business enterprise. And they mention the most notorious is the Virginia Company of London, and how through the aristocracy, and they name a bunch of names of the aristocracy who was behind the heads of human chattel, and then sending those chattel over to America for in permanent servitude or slavery. So if that was true, if these two authors, who I believe them, I think that they are arguing facts because they have a plethora of data. If it's true, then how can you argue that the servitude in the colonial period of America that enslaved white people is not the small representing the whole? So you would have to argue then that all white Americans, just as all Black Americans, would do reparations for their smaller population being enslaved, then the smaller population of whites, by the small representing the whole, they're due reparations as well. That's a counter argument. So I just find it very problematic that every Black in America is perceived as having been a slave, and every white American is perceived as having been a slave holder. And I have a big problem with this idea of superiority, which is a presupposition of the claims. So you could say that if you're the slave master by assumption, and I'm the slave by assumption, there's a presupposition of superiority and inferiority. And I disagree with that whole holistically.
Yeah, and I think that's what you meant by the white guilt, meaning or being equated to a pretense of moral authority. Correct? Is that the kind of...
Right. It's very, to me, it's very troubling.
Mm-hmm.
The reason it's troubling is because when I see myself as an academic, as a scholar, I don't see myself as inferior to anybody. But when I hear words like privilege, like white privilege, and because I teach communication, guess what I do when I hear a word? I think of its meaning. I think of its denotation and its connotation, meaning what is the most standard use of the word, its denotation, and then what is the connotation of the word, meaning its cultural meaning. So the word privilege, by definition, is advantage that is owed or accrued to an individual. But what is the opposite of privilege? Then it's necessarily disadvantage. So I'm, as a Black American, is supposed to sit back and just accept this idea that because of the color of my skin, I'm necessarily inferior and disadvantaged. And because of the color of someone else's skin, they are necessarily privileged and advantaged. If that is true, what is the measure or what is the threshold where a Black man such as myself will ever be advantaged? Does it take $6 billion like Kanye West is reported by Bloomberg to recently? A Bloomberg article said he's the second richest man next to Robert Smith.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and then we get into the just the legal, I mean, the legality is fraught with serious limitations. So even if we all agreed on, okay, we're going to give this amount of money as reparations, then in comes the legal challenges and how you, I was interested in this kind of how you laid out the law, and that justice can never be, I think it was, I wrote down justice can never be to the individual.
Oh, right. I got that from,
yes.
I got that from this book by Emil Brunner,
Yes.
Justice and the Social Order. And he was talking about the individuality of justice. It can never be custom tailored to the individual. It has to be blind. And what that means is justice is to settle equitably. That's justice. So when people talk about social justice, it negates the idea of justice. meaning that if social justice means that I get to pick the individual that justice best serves, then there's always going to be the what? The victim who is not selected for peculiar justice. And that's why I say the justice can't be fit like a custom tailored suit to one individual, and then the suit is stripped away from the other individual, leaving that individual naked of justice. It can't happen that way. So what happens is if white people in America are deemed the enemy by a genealogical necessity, meaning the color of their skin is their guiltiness, how does that serve Black Americans?
Yeah, and then the guilt by the fact that both are condemned by the past, both Black and white, because the culpability is put on one and the victimhood put on the other. Is that correct?
It's very, very problematical. Now, when I was during my MBA, I took a course called constitutional law. Now, I'm not an attorney, but I had enough coursework because in business programs, you have to take 2 courses of business law, then you have to take, and I took a elective called constitutional law. So I am good enough to understand legal definitions. And one of the things I understood is clean hands. Clean hands, or what some people call dirty hands doctrine, is, let's take a hypothetical. Let's say that you're going to get your house painted and you have 2 children, one is 12 and one is 14. And at that age of 14, people tend to be miscreants, right? Now, the painting company who painted your house says they're all done, they're ready to get their final payment, whatever you negotiate in terms of the stream of payments. So they're ready for their final payments. And you do your walkthrough, and on the back of the house, there's graffiti. And you're arguing back and forth with the painting company. Well, you all didn't do a good job. And they're arguing that that wasn't there when they finished. So they agreed to go ahead and paint it over because there's still a little paint left, but they're smart. What they do is they set up a little camera on the property to see what's going on. And what they find is that the parent of one of the children find that one of the 14-year-old is actually doing the graffiti. For whatever reasons, the 14-year-old decide. Now, when you show up to court, if you decide to sue this company, are your hands clean because you have the absolute responsibility for your minor children? Would the company be on the hook? Right? So right. If you are a Black person and you know about history, do you really have a genuine argument knowing full well that for 150, some people believe 170 years, white people were in absolute torment in the colonies? And according to Jordan and Walsh in their book, White Cargo, they're arguing that 75%, this is their statistic, they say 75% of the white people in the colonial period of America were slaves, by the euphemism indentured servant. Some were not, some were pure convicts that this transportation law that was signed by James I, they were transported for the minimum amount of infractions because they needed heads, right? And for each head, they got the people who were invested in these stock companies, they got 50 acres of land. And it was white people who were clearing out this wilderness. I mean, can you imagine what America was like with all this rich soil, untapped, and leaves decaying and rotting all these hundreds of years? Can you imagine how much fertility that was to clear out? I mean, I've chopped down a tree before with an axe, and I know what it's like to chop down one tree. Can you imagine that's your life? So they were worked to death, literally. Many of those convicts who were sent to the colonies were worked to death. And white people were, and this is established even by some of our Black scholars like Joel Augustus Rogers, that many of these white slaves were worked literally to death, right? Mm-hmm. So when you think about that, you have to think about, how is it that these people, both white and Black, who came as slaves, ended up purchasing their own freedom and then ended up purchasing land, and then ended up purchasing slaves. And one mentioned in the 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro by both Joel Augustus Rogers, and he did like a paragraph form book. It's sort of like a booklet, or sort of like the size of a novella. But Henry Louis Gates Jr. over at Harvard, his is a more succinct book. And Henry Louis Gates and Joel Augustus Rogers mentions the guy John Carruthers Stanley, who had 163 slaves, and he had 3 white overseers, one per his slave plantations. Now, were these Black slave owners better to their slaves than the whites? Or if a slave ran off from a Black plantation or a white plantation, was the penalty the same? And they mentioned many of the penalties. You could get manacled, meaning they would put chains on you. You could get limbed. They could cut pieces or all of a limb off. You got whipped at the whipping post. For the indentured servants, according to this Jordan and Walsh, they said that for every day that you ran off, they would add a year. And they had a number of infractions and the type of penalty associated with each infraction. So if you were an indentured servant and you were getting whooped, and then you ended up getting your freedom, and then you ended up purchasing slaves, can we take a modern look and judge what these people were doing that many years ago accurately and honestly, and say that what they were doing, the cruelty that they were doing to each other, is reflective of a penalty that we should put on innocent people today? I don't think so.
Right. And then that brings up kind of the statute of limitation, legal standing.
Oh, yeah.
All these different ways that could be challenged legitimately in court. Because, I mean, it's been so long. How do you prove that you were wronged? And how do you prove that, like, white people were, I mean, my family came here in the, great, in the 1900s, right? So I couldn't prove that my family owned slaves. But what I need to, that's that's part of the problem of standing and statute of limitation and whose group membership, I think is how you mentioned it in the article.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I mentioned the little lady. She is on YouTube, probably took her down. But I showed this video in my class, one of my graduate classes, and boy, you can't help but laugh because it's so funny, because it's so genuine. Nia Hope, and this was in 2019 where the video was uploaded, and she did a live reveal, and she was sure, because her skin is so pure and dark, a little bit, probably a shade darker than mine, and her face is a very unique, interesting face. It's a face like some women are probably paying $30,000, $40,000 to get adjustments to have a face like that. But she was dissatisfied with not knowing her sub-Saharan African ancestry. And she did a mitochondrial DNA test and found out that 40% of her ancestry was European. And she was not happy about it. So she burst into tears, and she was obviously so hurt and chagrined by this news. But to me, it's a very poignant lesson that genealogy, if it was determined by DNA, means that most Americans wouldn't have to pay reparations if the one-drop rule still applies. I mean, you can't find an American, maybe Elizabeth Warren, when she did her blood test, and she found that, what was she, like 90%? I forget what it was, but she was very, very European, right? But that's going to be very rare in America. So what happens, and what is the threshold as a measure of your Blackness? Is it 40% to get a check? If guiltiness is determined by who was and who was not a slave, we have the whole colonial period of white Americans who were enslaved against their will and treated to some of the most horrific tortures and punishments when they tried to evade their captors or run off from the plantations, right? So first you have the broken link of slavery. Second, you have such a impractical measure of what Blackness is. What is it in terms of who you are? But if it's the one drop rule, that means hardly anybody's going to have to pay, right? On the reverse side, if you are one drop rule, then that means you are Black and you get paid. So where do we cut it off? And then if we say that, okay, you need at least 40%, because you know of the 162 million Americans who classify themselves as white, as soon as something as reparations, depending on the magnitude and the scale of the payment, let's say it's $150,000, just an arbitrary number. There are going to be so many people doing DNA tests, and then what court of jurisdiction is going to have the authority or the righteous justification to make the cutoff at what percent? Regardless of whatever the percent of race mixture is, it's going to be very, very difficult to the people who didn't meet the standard. And then you're going to have resentment and conflict as you do now. So that's why I think that this whole thing is more political than practicable, because resentment politics is a very lucrative field for unfortunately, a lot of individuals.
Yes, it's interesting. So in the final analysis, I think to kind of wrap it up, put a little head on it. Yeah, I think you kind of hit your last paragraph basically says exactly what you just said, which is that, tremendous amount of who and how and why. So would you, if in a perfect world, you could end, or what would happen to this debate in your estimation?
Well, one of the more sobering, what I would do is I would make sure that people are properly educated as to the misery and misfortune of all early Americans. They treated each other like crap. It also is not a race based on color. If that were true, no Black would have ever been permitted. Now, there was the law, remember the statute, that Henning statute, Act 5 that I mentioned in the paper, where in 1670, Black Christians who were free were purchasing white Christians, right? And they said that's a no-no. But they didn't say you can't purchase slaves. You just couldn't purchase white Christians, right? And it also, to me, it seemed more like what the social cultural anthropologists call a trial by ordeal and a rite of passage. So some of the former slaves who purchased their freedom because slaves could work on Sunday, they were able to amass enough fortune where they could purchase their freedom. Then eventually they got some hectares of land, and then they had to have some means of working the land. There were no motorized vehicles. There were no tractors, right? So how are you going to make the land profitable unless you had a crop that you could trade for money, right? So all of us have heard about the triangular trade, right? Sugar to molasses, molasses to rum, and then rum for slaves. But the larger problem is this aggressive pitting of Americans against Americans based on this arbitrary criteria of genealogy is very problematical. And the reason is that I think some are genuine, but I think some are disingenuous in that America is the land of boundless opportunities. And if you take the individuals who have been very successful, who are Black Americans, or some people who go by African American, if you take those very successful people, what happens is you see, okay, this is an exception. Now, in the mind's eye, what you need to think about is what an exception is. So if an exception happens twice, is it still an exception? If it happens 20 times, at a certain point, we have what's called a statistical curve, right? So when a number gets large enough, it starts to shape on its own, it starts to become what's called a bell shape. We've got so many successful Black people in this country that are they still an exception? Or are they more akin to what Thomas Sowell have been arguing for decades, that it's about values and the cultural values that are much more of factors in success. For example, if you look at Black male success, there's longitudinal studies where we know that 3 in 5 Black men are very successful if they have these 3 factors: religious affiliation, if they have higher education with a valuable skill, and then marriage. Those 3 factors are the prominent factors in Black male success. So if you say that you can be successful in America and you can go all the way up to $6.6 billion, like the wealth of Kanye or Robert Smith, who has like 11.5 billion in estimate, then Beyonce and Jay-Z, and not just entertainers, right? Athletes. And then not just athletes, then you get into what in the book Millionaire Next Door, Danko and Stanley call the net worth millionaires, where people with assets minus who they owe, a liability, is equal to your net worth. When you look at net worth millionaires, let's say that in America we have 1 million out of the, I don't know what it is now, but the population of Blacks was 42.7 million in the 2010 census. Let's say that number in the 2020, I haven't looked it up, but let's say the number in 2020 census is 46 million. Well, if 4 million of 46 million are net worth millionaires, is that a coincidence of a systemic racist society, or does it negate the argument of a systemically racist society? So all of these talking points of systemic racism, white privilege, and all that stuff, I think that it's very problematical in that the goal of much of the communication is all about friction and enmity and animus between people. And the biggest culprit, unfortunately, is greed. Greed in the mainstream media. In my professional opinion, as a person who teaches communication, there's so much dishonesty. And in academics, we teach 2 ways that scholars can be dishonest. Like if you take this paper that we're talking about now, I have a reference. And I ask you to read my references. I even sent emails saying, well, check this out before we talk because it'll make for better discussion. What that says is that I have clean hands. I don't have anything to hide. You could rebuke or criticize my paper. You could publish a criticism. And guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to respond. So I'm going to criticize your criticism. And then the knowledge is upward and onward forever. But the worst thing that you can do in terms of being an honest intellect is lie by commission and then lie by omission. And what we see is that the people who are arguing for reparations are lying by omission. It's just not true that every Black person in America is a subject of slavery and a descendant of people who were slaves. It's just not the case. It is certainly not the case that white people were all slaveholders, because if you look at the year 1830, that Carter G. Woodson, and I got that from Henry Louis Gates's book, 80% of white Americans never owned a single slave in the year 1830. And then 96% of the Blacks who were free never owned a single slave. So it was a minority who was particularly cruel to a larger minority, but the vast majority of people in the United States of America didn't have anything to do with slavery. And then this last point, you have to think about this. Americans alive when Crispus Attucks fired the bullet in the Boston Tea Party, who was Black, by the way, and he was killed, and they called it the slaughter, right, which led to the initiation of the revolution. Well, a few decades later, we had the Civil War. There are people who were alive who had ear witness, meaning all those people who ran off from the slave plantations, Blacks and whites were running off together. When they went and they got freedom, don't you think that they had familial memory that those stories would? They didn't have TV, so what do you think they talked about? So in my personal opinion, when that Civil War happened, I think you had people who had empathy for what the slaves were going through, because that was one of the most still the bloodiest war in American history, where, you know, when you ran, you couldn't load your musket fast enough, and you had the bayonet at the tip of the rifle, and they were slaughtering each other. They created the Gatling gun. They started boring the barrels of their guns for more accuracy. So it was a terrible, but why would white Americans, why would they slaughter and subject themselves to be slaughtered if they didn't have empathetic memory to the horrors of slavery? And I think many of them remember that their own forefathers were indentured into slavery. And I think that's what gave them impetus to fight as heroically as they did. So I don't need to sit here and do a Sermon on the Mount or a Gettysburg Address to make crystal clear that I think reparations is not a winnable argument.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.